A little bit faster. Hurry up.
Well, it took me a second, and by a second I mean an entire award season, but I'm officially on the Anora bandwagon. For months now, people have been telling me how incredible this film is, and yet every time I went to watch it, something came up.
Everybody's so sorry, I have to go.
Or more accurately, I found something else to do and then told myself I'd circle back to it eventually. Only to never actually do that, and I'd be lying if I said this stalling wasn't at least partially motivated by the fact that I've never been too big a fan of Shawn Baker. Like, I can certainly appreciate efforts like The Florida Project and Tangerine for the exceptional pieces of filmmaking they are, and the incredible performances he manages to get out of his actors, but none of his films have ever really clicked for me, at least not to the degree they clearly clicked for everyone else. So when Anora crashed onto the scene last year, riding a massive wave of acclaim out of Cannes, I had no doubt it was as great as its advocates claimed. I just wasn't so sure it'd be for me. It wasn't until the film started winning awards and was a massive contender, arguably the contender this season, that my interest was genuinely piqued. Not because I think awards are in any way a reliable metric for determining a film's quality, no, but because I actually got to hear Shawn Baker talk about his work, and what I heard surprised me.
Okay.
Despite being a film about sex work, the topic seemed more like a secondary concern for Baker in these speeches. Sure, he'd acknowledge sex workers and even thank them for providing insights into the nature of their profession, but these overtures felt ancillary to a more personal concern: independent filmmaking.
I come from the independent film world. Lots of us wear many hats in this world. So I'm a writer, director, editor. I have a stiff neck.
In a way, this isn't all that surprising. Anora is an indie film, and Shawn Baker, as an avowed indie lifer, wants to use the platform afforded to him to rally support for the cause. Indie films make up a smaller and smaller share of the market with every passing year as the major studios continue to abandon low and mid-budget films in favor of heavily commercial behemoths with the potential to yield a massive return.
That's the goal, to be able to sleep that night.
And while smaller studios like Neon and A24 have carved out a niche in the market to protect these smaller films from the rising tide, there's no question that indies are locked in a fight for survival right now. Yet, despite this perfectly adequate rationale, I couldn't shake the feeling there was more to his preoccupation.
But I just want to use this moment to speak about the current state of indie film.
Why bring it up so frequently and foreground it so emphatically? So, after putting it off for so long, I finally relented and watched the film, and lo and behold, the answer was even more obvious than I could have imagined. I mean, the film is great. It's absolutely fantastic, one of the best of the year, and I won't be mad when it wins Best Picture. But the reason Shawn Baker keeps talking about independent filmmaking in his acceptance speeches is because that's kinda what the film is about. No, not literally. I mean, Anora is undeniably about the social and economic pressures that drive the adult entertainment industry in America, and the psychological toll the disparity of power inherent to that industry has on the workers within it. But in exploring that idea, Baker is able to paint a broader critique of a society that positions stability and autonomy as opposing sides in a zero-sum game. A dynamic that reflects the trade-off independent filmmakers are often forced to grapple with. This is well-worn territory for Baker, whose films frequently use aspects of the entertainment industry as a way into the tumultuous lives of those living in the margins of American society. The most prominent example being The Florida Project, in which the events of the story are deliberately juxtaposed with Disney World, in contrasting the simulated opulence of the so-called happiest place on earth with all too real poverty of those living at the Magic Castle Inn and Suites, located mere miles away. Baker hammers home the cruel absurdity of the suffering our society is built around. In Anora, Baker flips this script slightly. Instead of using entertainment as a window into the neglected corners of American society, he uses the struggles of marginalized people as a proxy for the plight of independent filmmaking. Which isn't to say Baker isn't interested in the obstacles sex workers face. I mean, have you seen most of the guy's other films? It's almost a fixation for the man. Nor is it to say he thinks his struggles are of the same magnitude of theirs, but rather that he sees commonality between these two worlds that would otherwise seem totally removed from one another if not for the tension between liberation and exploitation they both exemplify.
Why am I talking about this today? because I'm an indie film lifer. And I know that there are other indie film lifers in this room.
For as complicated as Shawn Baker's politics appear to be, at least insofar as his social media followers would suggest, Anora may be the clearest example of class solidarity put to film in recent years. A fucked up Cinderella story about the ways in which our capitalistic society regularly makes financial security and uninhibited self-expression mutually exclusive conditions. But while we're talking about Anora, the Oscars are this Sunday, March 2nd, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a frontrunner stronger than Anora. It won the PGA, it won the DGA, it's probably going to win Best Picture at the Oscars. And if you're feeling as confident as I am that Anora is going to walk home with the grand prize, why not put your money where your mouth is with today's sponsor, Kalshi? That's right, folks, you can vote on any Oscar category you can possibly imagine, any topic surrounding the Oscar in all 50 states in the US. Kalshi is the first and only legal prediction market that lets you bet on real-world events. So whether it's who will win elections, the Grammys, the Oscars, really any awards show, who's going to be the next James Bond, you can bet on almost anything with Kalshi. So let's look at what the Kalshi markets have to say about the Oscars. If you go here to the Oscars dashboard, you can see that you can bet on almost anything. Best Actress, Best Supporting Actor, Best Picture, obviously, all of the categories, even some that's like how many Oscars will Dune Part 2 win? Just questions that are all on our minds. So the big one that's on a lot of our minds is who's going to win Best Actor? This is probably the closest race of the night. So let's check it out. So if we go over here for Best Actor, we have Adrien Brody, Timothée Chalamet, and Ralph Fiennes. And so obviously with the SAGs and Timothée Chalamet winning the SAGs, that gave him a big boost.
I'm really in pursuit of greatness.
But Adrien Brody won the BAFTAs.
Adrien Brody.
He's won all the precursors and is still kind of the favorite going into the night. So I'd be happy with either one, but I'm going to go with Brody. So Adrien Brody is favored at 66%, which is 66 cents on the dollar. Say that you put down 66 cents, you would get $1 back should he actually win. And that is just one of many categories, as I've explained, that you can bet on. Best sound design, best animated feature, is the wild robot going to take it home? But most importantly, Kalshi has markets on almost everything. They have over 1 million users in all 50 states and have facilitated over $1 billion worth of trades. I think it's pretty cool. It's a fun opportunity to make events like this interesting. So what are you waiting for? Put your money where your mouth is and sign up using my link in the description of this video. The first 500 traders who trade 100 contracts will get a free $10 credit. That's the first 500 traders who trade 100 contracts will get a free $10 credit. So get in there, go have fun this Oscar Sunday, and thank you so much to Kalshi for sponsoring this video. While it's fair to say that Shawn Baker's speeches predisposed me to watching Anora as a commentary on independent filmmaking, I think the parallel between these two professions is somewhat inescapable regardless. Let me explain. The film opens with an extended sequence at headquarters, the high-end New York strip club that Anora, or Annie for short, works at. In the sequence, we watch Annie tirelessly work the room, propositioning patrons and then providing them with a service, a provocative dance. What is for these men the fulfillment of a fantasy is to Annie a simple, dispassionate transaction, firmly establishing what Annie does as work, not dissimilar to any other form of labor. While there's certainly a parallel between what Annie is doing and the way independent films are financed, it's once Annie starts working exclusively for Yvonne, a high-profile client who pays her for sex outside of her work as an exotic dancer and winds up taking a liking to her, that the ways in which Annie's work reflects that of an independent filmmaker come into clear focus. In Yvonne, Annie finds the financial security she's been desperate for. Once the pair marry, Yvonne's wealth provides a comfortable life in which Annie no longer has to sell her labor to make ends meet. But that stability comes with its own strings, because Yvonne's stability is not all it seems. In reality, he's just as dependent as she is. I mean, arguably more so, but to much more powerful figures. In this case, his parents. And when he disobeys them by marrying Annie, the both of them become subject to their reprisals. Yvonne's father, a powerful Russian oligarch, and his mother, the stern matriarch of the family empire, have invested heavily into their son, and therefore expect a return on that investment. They might be bankrolling his comfortable life, but the price is Yvonne's autonomy. He isn't his own man, free to make his own decisions or chart his own course in life. he's little more than an extension of his parents and beholden to their wishes. Put another way, Ivan is a studio filmmaker. Sure, money is no object to him, but it's not his money, and therefore he isn't at liberty to spend it however he wants.
Some of us want to make personal films that are intended for theatrical release with subject matter that would never be greenlit by the big studios.
Viewed through this lens, it's not hard to see his marriage to Annie as akin to when a studio filmmaker attempts to make a bold creative decision in their big budget film only to incur the wrath of executives holding the purse strings. Ivan's parents fly all the way from Russia to visit the set, as it were, with the goal of overriding his decision and putting things back on track, annulling the marriage and setting Ivan up with a more structured position in the family's business. In contrast, Annie very clearly embodies the independent filmmaker. While her work involves a degree of exploitation, she literally has to sell parts of herself to clients to get the money she needs, that money is ultimately hers, and the way in which she gets that money is also up to her. Yes, she's also being exploited, but she has the freedom to live her life the way she wants to. She can be the person she wants to be. She can tell people no.
Once you give me health insurance, then you can tell me when I work and not work.
And you see that come to fruition in her relationship with Ivan. She gets frustrated when he kind of becomes meek and does whatever his parents tell him to do, because that's not who she is. That's not what she would ever do. She would never let anyone tell her what to do. She may be a victim of this capitalistic machine that we all live in, but she's going to take her slice of it and do what she wants with it. The only issue is the money she earns is seldom enough to change her circumstances. Her work doesn't provide basic benefits like healthcare or retirement savings, and her income is entirely dependent on the whims of her clients. If she can't sell them her pitch, she doesn't make any money. This is a precarious way to live, one that fundamentally alters the way in which she views the world. By necessity, Annie sees every interaction she has as transactional. Every person is a potential client, an opportunity to further her position in life. So it's not hard to understand the allure someone like Ivan has to her, much like the indie filmmaker who has grown tired of the constant need to sell themselves just to stay afloat. Not because she's a quote-unquote gold digger, as so many women who are compelled to marry for financial reasons are often labeled, but because her lived experience has taught her to view all her relationships in this transactional way. It's this same reason we don't blame an indie filmmaker whenever they sign a Marvel contract. There's a difference between selling out and getting that bag. Sure, they might not be free to make their movie the way they want to, but they'll have all the money in the world to make something, and they won't have to grind just to stay alive. We can understand why you'd make that trade-off, even if it isn't ideal, but throughout the film, Annie is forced to confront the unpleasant consequences of that compromise. When Ivan's parents bear down on him for defying their will, Annie more or less becomes a hostage, forced to help the people in charge rectify the situation, even though the solution comes at her own expense. Yet she clings to the hope that Ivan will stand by her, stand by his creative decision, if you will, despite the fact everyone around her keeps explaining that he won't, because it's not really his life to control, not really his movie. In the end, these doubts are proven correct, and Ivan acquiesces to his parents' demands, going along with the annulment. It's only then that Annie finally acknowledges the truth she's been trying to avoid from the moment she met him. Ivan is pitiful. He has all the money in the world, and for what? So he can do exactly what he's told? No freedom, no autonomy, no self-expression, a dog on a leash? A pampered dog, to be sure, but still a dog. Annie may have had to sell parts of herself to get what she wants, but at least she's in control of her own life. And to punctuate this point, she signs the annulment and returns everything Ivan ever gave her. Not because she has to, but because she chooses to. By that same token, Shawn Baker is telling us that in spite of how demoralizing and occasionally degrading it can be to finance indie films,
We want complete artistic freedom and the freedom to cast who is right for the role, not who is forced to cast considering box office value or how many followers they have on social media.
No matter how many rooms he has to work or how many clients he has to proposition to sell his fantasy, his work is his own.
Why am I talking about this today? Because I'm an indie film lifer.
100%, no compromises, or at least no compromises to the art. Because if the final scene with Ivan and his family is a triumphant affirmation of Annie's autonomy, then the film's final moments are a bleak reminder of its cost. When Igor, one of the men hired to facilitate the undoing of Annie and Ivan's marriage, drops Annie off at her sister's apartment, he reveals he kept the wedding ring he had confiscated earlier in the film and offers it back to her. Overwhelmed by the kindness of this action, the culmination of a string of unconditional acts of kindness Igor has shown her throughout the film, Annie climbs across the car's console and begins having sex with him. But unlike every other sexual interaction we've seen Annie engaged in throughout the entire film, and boy, there are a lot of them, this moment is quiet and tender, and as Igor goes in to kiss Annie, she freaks out and begins sobbing into Igor's arms. It's in this moment Annie finally recognizes the way in which her life of only just getting by has warped the way in which she sees the world. In the face of Igor's kind, selfless act of love, her instinctual reaction was to treat it as just any other transaction. In the moment it becomes impossible to view it that way, she breaks down, overwhelmed by the shame. She might not be directly beholden to moneyed interests the way Ivan is, but her freedom isn't free. She's very much still beholden to money, so much so that it robbed her of her ability to simply live her life.
If one is trying to support a family. I personally do not have children, but I know for a fact that if I did, I would not be able to make the movies that I make.
What should be plainly obvious is the way in which this comparison between sex workers and independent filmmakers is just one part of the film's broader critique of capitalism. While I'm not entirely sure Shawn Baker would use those exact terms to describe his film very much engages with the idea that the relationship between the upper and lower classes is inherently and unjustly exploitative. While Annie doesn't seem to find her sex work disagreeable or degrading in and of itself, it's clear she probably wouldn't be doing it were it not for the financial benefit. Something made evident by the fact she immediately stops dancing once she gets married to Ivan. As she's collecting her belongings from headquarters upon returning from her Vegas wedding, Annie revels in getting out of that line of work. She even makes a direct allusion to Cinderella, a would-be princess plucked from a life of manual labor to enjoy a life of comfort and status. In framing the sex work this way, the film positions Annie's sex work as a form of exploitation. The clients at HQ might not be overtly coercing her into performing, but without the money, she wouldn't be. Therefore, the money is a kind of coercion. However, it isn't until Annie marries Ivan that this dynamic is made explicit. Annie's desperation to hold on to her marriage despite the fact Ivan has very clearly betrayed her reveals the bedrock of exploitation that has underpinned their entire relationship. Even after Ivan stopped paying Annie for sex, their relationship was a transaction in which Annie relied on Ivan for support. Ivan might not have been handing cash over anymore, but he was still paying for Annie. And when that arrangement is jeopardized, Annie clings to the way one would cling to a crappy job for fear of going broke without it. She deludes herself into thinking it's something more. But the truth is, she's scared of losing her chance to escape the life she used to live. But the irony is, she simply swapped one thankless job for another, albeit one with slightly nicer benefits, but, slightly less freedom. This exploration is similarly reflected in the three enforcers Ivan's parents send to get the situation under control: Taros, Garnik, and Igor.
I'm Igor.
All three men have more in common with Annie than they do with Ivan or his oligarch parents. They're just people doing a job. However, their job is to enforce the divide between the upper and lower classes by protecting the interests of those at the top by keeping everyone else below in check. Like Annie, they don't serve at their own pleasure, nor are they emotionally invested in the work they're doing. In fact, they actively resent having to babysit their boss's spoiled little heir. They serve because the alternative is losing the little wealth and status they've accrued. We see this especially in Taros, who becomes increasingly more dogged in his hunt for Yvonne as the night wears on, destroying his own property and pushing himself to his mental limits in the pursuit of satisfying his masters. Likewise, Garnick, who is very clearly unwell following a kick to the face that breaks his nose, probably has a concussion, maybe even more, I mean, who knows, but he remains with the party the entire time, despite needing immediate medical attention because tending to his own needs would jeopardize his financial security. Everyone in the film is motivated into betraying their own self-interests for the promise of financial gain, which is dangled over them by the wealthy to serve their own selfish ends. Even someone like Yvonne, who is the direct beneficiary of this system, is himself a victim. A listless man-child who can't risk biting the hand that feeds him lest it cut off his access to wealth and power, and so pathetically resigns himself to passivity, despite yearning for a semblance of autonomy. And I think part of what makes this exploration of class especially effective is Baker's refusal to paint either side with a broad brush. Taros, Garnick, and Igor aren't depicted as monsters for their willingness to sell their morals for cash. At heart, all three are decent men, they're just stuck at the bottom of a fucked up hierarchy. One of the most touching moments in the film for me was when Taros thanked Annie for her cooperation with the divorce lawyer. On top of being a funny moment for its absurdity, like, thanking someone for cooperating after the insane ordeal they just went through is so fucking funny. It's a genuine moment of solidarity between two people who are ultimately on the same side of the struggle, despite being on opposed ends of the stick. Likewise, Yvonne isn't a monster either. I mean, he's spineless and immature, and he's kind of an asshole, but he isn't overtly cruel, which would have been a really easy direction to take a character like this. The closest he gets to intentional malice is when he screams at the hotel manager, only to play it off as a gotcha moment, and in the end, when he thanks her for making his final time in America so much fun, he seemingly means it sincerely. To him, the situation was never that serious. He doesn't even seem to be aware of how much their marriage changed the material conditions of Annie's life. The cruelty of his actions isn't the result of personal flaws, but rather an unavoidable byproduct of his wealth. In the end, Baker argues that the problem of interclass exploitation is systemic, not just the actions of ill-intentioned individuals. So, yeah, I really regret putting Anora off as long as I have, because it genuinely is one of the year's best films. From Drew Daniels' gorgeous, naturalistic cinematography that at once makes the gritty streets of New York City feel chaotic and intimate, to the unbelievably funny script that plays out like the glorious love child of Uncut Gems and Fargo. I mean, there was a certain point where I was watching, I was like, fuck, this is like a feature-length episode of Barry. I am so in love with all of this. To Mikey Madison's fearless, incredibly authentic, raw, and empathetic star-making lead performance, Anora is, for my money, the best film of Shawn Baker's career thus far. An unconditional triumph that couches heady themes in an exhilarating caper that's likely to enthrall mass audiences just as much as it does fans of indie cinema. I could seriously go on and on about this movie. It's seriously a film I'm going to be revisiting for years to come. So much of the cinema we love is the product of a broken system that unfairly asks artists to make incredible personal sacrifices in pursuit of their vision. And while that undoubtedly needs to change, films like Anora and filmmakers like Shawn Baker prove that sometimes true autonomy is worth the struggle.
This is for all the indie film lifers who are holding on and fighting the good fight. Thank you so much.